Hello and welcome back to day 2, session 1,5, I guess, which I think will be to some extent a continuation and introducing very different elements also into the discussion that we just had. It will be between Christian Höller and Helmut Draxler, nearest to me. Helmut is an art historian, art critic, curator, and professor of art theory at the Merz Academy in Stuttgart. Prior to that, he was director of the Kunstverein in Munich from 1992 to 1995. More recent curatorial projects include the exhibition Shandyismus, Shandyism, Authorship as Genre, at the Secession in Vienna in 2007. Draxler writes extensively on contemporary art and theory for a variety of international magazines and artist catalogues, and his book-length publications include Film Avant-Garde Biopolitics, with Sabit Buchmann and Stefan Gehner, and Coercing Constellations, Space, Reference and Representation in Farid Amelie. Draxler lives and works in Berlin and Stuttgart. Christian Höller is a theorist, art critic and editor of the magazine Springerin, which is based in Vienna. He was a visiting professor at the École des Beaux-Arts in Geneva from 2002 to 2007. He has published numerous monographic essays, and among the volumes he has edited are Technovisionen in 2005 and Pop Unlimited in 2001. Höller lives and works in Vienna. I just have a couple of explanations to give, and then I'll read a brief abstract of their conversation. There's been some talk about the reason that the screen, which I realise I'm on now, the screen which is above the speakers' heads, the problem is that those people at the back really cannot see anything. So I know it's a little bit distracting that there's a half-second delay between sound and voice, sound and vision. But I hope that you can bear with us, because otherwise the faces and the expressions are completely lost for 80% of the audience. I hope that's a reasonable explanation. The conversation between Helmut and Christian will survey the conditions that allowed institutional critique to resurge in the 90s as a major point of critique in the art system, and the subsequent merger between the values of flexibility with the needs of post-Fordist neoliberal management. They explore how the position of the independent curator evolved into that of a cultural free agent, which I think will return to, in some way, to some things that were spoken about by Tom particularly earlier, and how that cultural free agent disseminated knowledge and new formats of institutions were created through that mechanism in the understanding of the arts as a creative industry in the service economy. So if I could ask Christian to begin. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Charles, for that introduction and the setup, so to speak, for this conversation, which I will plunge into very directly with a couple of more structural or conceptual points that I want to raise with respect to institutional critique, because in my mind, institutional critique with respect to Western art institutions has always occupied a slightly paradoxical position. And by this I mean that it has tried to go against the very conditions that guaranteed its emergence and existence in the first place. But what's more, it has somehow remained blind, in my mind, towards the very ideological basis of its primary target, namely a grounding in Western liberal democracy, which of course has neither been all that liberal nor democratic in the first place. So looking back a little, the trajectory of institutional critique as it evolved with respect to Western art institutions from the late 1960s onwards can roughly be traced like this. A first model, so to speak, took for granted a relatively clearly defined opponent, if you can call it that. Namely, institutional power understood in a fairly homogeneous sense, and by this I mean organized in a kind of top-down way with hierarchical authoritarian structure. Now, in a quite straightforward manner, one could say, the first wave of institutional critique subjected the overall framework of art institutions to critical, often investigative examination. Sometimes it extended this focus towards other social institutions as well. from particular apparatuses of the state, like for instance, like back in the 1960s, you have to remember the military, for instance, schools, universities, bureaucracy, etc., all the way to more social or gender-related or also ethnic power structures. Now, all of these issues that I just mentioned entered, and this of course goes a long way back, at some point or other, into critical art's sharpened field of vision. But this already points way beyond an institutional critique in a more classical sense. Now, common to both variants, whether they proceeded from an artistic or a social institution, was a kind of simple oppositional or a kind of bipolar pattern. And one has to remember that there was still a kind of bipolar, at least from the perspective of the West, like bipolar in the sense of East-West or that kind of divide, a bipolar world back then. On the one hand, a despotic institution tending towards authoritarian behavior and the concealment of its power, and on the other, the morally superior or educational gesture of a critique which perceived itself in relation to the former as somehow independent and external. Regardless of whether it was targeting the economic intrigues behind a large museum structure, for instance, or the mechanisms of exclusion with regard to, for instance, female artists or artists of ethnic background, this position considered itself to be on a morally upright and uncompromised territory. Now, at the same time, it has also to be acknowledged that this critical position was, of course, itself entangled in the very institutional relations it was targeting, something which could not always be immediately recognized. So, for instance, criticism of the ownership structure of something like the Guggenheim could only be effectively made public if it came from a recognized artist who had already entered into proximity to a museum of this sort. Daniel Buren, for instance, once said, and I quote, "You're invited by people who like you, people who admire you, and probably share your critical position. So you're fighting against a bloc, but ironically, inside this bloc, you have a lot of friends who have the same attitude," unquote. Now, this already foreshadows what more currently, in my mind, characterizes the kind of vexed position that institutional critique finds itself in particular with respect to today's institutions. The irony or paradox of early institutional critique was really about this sort of strange positioning of the critical attitude, so to speak. There's someone who pretends to be totally outside, but who, of course, has very close connections to decision makers or people inside, who goes against an overall institutional structure, but that institutional structure enables this kind of attack or critique in the very first place. Thereby, of course, it is demonstrating how immune it somehow is against this kind of criticism in the very last instance. Or should one rather conclude that this is a game in which the institution just comes out stronger than ever, while at the same time the artist has gained his share of critical credibility, that there is a sort of game going on, a game of repressive tolerance, if you want to call it that, against the accumulation of symbolic capital, which only seems to leave one participant in the whole process kind of dumbfounded, namely the audience. I put a question mark to this. Now, of course, this is totally overstating and exaggerating the point, but sometimes in retrospect, it seems that, that was what was sort of going on. Now, anyway, there is another, for a long time, unrecognized aspect to all this. Once such critique takes on a certain institution, there is in principle no reason to hold back from other contested areas connected to this particular institutional makeup. If, for instance, the primary focus lays upon the structure of ownership of a particular museum, this inevitably leads to economic and of course subsequently political concerns. Now once that door opens, something like the dark shadows of Western liberal democracy start crawling in. All those scattered realms where the consequences of, for instance, real estate holdings and dealings, the war industry, or corporate power quite generally are persistently noticeable. Now maybe jump ahead a little. Maybe today's institutions have been sanitized a little in that respect. But I guess if you dig long enough, you can probably come up with some dubious economic connection behind every bigger art institution these days. Now, whether or not this was apparent to the practitioners of early institutional critique, and I of course assume it was, their kind of solution seemed to consist in a kind of reduced, serial manner of framing the problematic situation. And you only have to think, of course, of the classic Hans Hake piece about Schapolsky. Now, from a strategic point of view, it might of course make more sense to target a specific real estate holder instead of corporate power altogether. But the open question remains how to do justice to the actual workings and entanglements of power in a more extended framework. So not just a corporate power in this kind of top-down authoritarian mode, but maybe also including the contributions of more bottom-up or maybe also critical attitudes that help consolidate that power. Or maybe also art's many entanglements with different theaters of power. Now this larger problematic or symptomatic is something that hardly anyone in the West has tackled so far. Something also that art alone will not be able to tackle in any meaningful way. Maybe this is also the main reason why art has to reach out to other disciplines and start working in more interdisciplinary ways, and I'm sure we will come back later to this point. But of course, even then, the question remains, what would be the proper forum for such a more extended critique? But I want to add another consideration here in order to show that this paradoxical situation of institutional critique is not all that easily resolved. In more recent times, and parallel to developments in theoretical discourse, critical art practice found itself confronted with, and this has been mentioned already, and I guess yesterday many times as well, critical art found itself confronted with a crucial shift concerning power relations altogether. Part of this may have to do with the fact that larger institutions have changed their more authoritarian look and behavior over the years and decades, maybe not their economic backgrounds, but definitely the way in which they deal with open challenge and critique. So, for instance, censorship cases like the one in 1971 with Hake and the Guggenheim have become extremely rare these days. At the same time, and this is equally important, a huge number of much more fluid, more temporary, and almost immaterial institutions have emerged over the years. Institutions which present themselves in much friendlier and sometimes quite fancy ways. Now, of course, the background to this is the establishment of different modes of domination and governing, models of so-called soft power, flattened hierarchies, a much greater emphasis on self-responsibility, self-organization on behalf of everyone working within such institutions. Now, this might probably also be the main reason, or at least a crucial point, why it has become so incredibly hard for a real contemporary version of institutional critique to target any institution in a meaningful or purposeful way. Now, these days, the image is rather like that artists, curators, and institutions are always already on the same side. But the question really remains, at least referring to that earlier wave, who is the enemy, or who might the enemy be? At least this is one is tempted to ask at this point. Now, what has definitely not gone away are the numerous practices of, as I said, governing and disciplining, even self-disciplining, that are still effective within these newly established, flattened or softer hierarchies. With contemporary institutions having opened their doors so extremely wide for critical endeavors of all sorts, it has somehow become more of a challenge, in my view, to see one's own entanglements in power relations and disciplinary modes as a kind of starting point. More, for instance, than to target an external enemy or institutional forces in the classic orthodox way. Since criticality these days has become a kind of a must, the more relevant question has somehow shifted towards the problem how, on what basis, and without ignoring one's own positioning, one can start to develop a critical attitude towards institutional structures altogether. Maybe, on the other hand, that's not really necessary anymore, since there is nowadays, of course, a complex interpenetration of sorts that hardly leaves anything or anyone out of its scope. Now, in fact, there's barely a space of an outside in an overall setting that knits together the following, and I'll name 3 players or constituents here. One is those softened institutional structures that I mentioned. The second would be the new disciplinary modes that run across the whole of society. And the third part would be a self which is entangled in complex ways in both of the former. And here, in my mind, it does not make much difference if this position of the self is occupied by the artist, the curator, or the spectator. Now, this overall change of perspective, simply put, implies that it is no longer us within or vis-à-vis particular institutions, but that the institutions has for quite a long time, maybe all along, been inside us. Again, overstating or exaggerating the point. Now that a process of internalization, and with this I am referring to the approach that someone like Andrea Fraser is taking these days towards institutional critique. Now that a process of internalization has happened, which has entangled the players even more with each other than they had ever been before. Now, this idea of internalization, or mutual penetration, as one might say, goes hand in hand with another big shift that I want to mention as my very last point. Once you recognize that the institution or the institutional framework never simply consists in a particular material setting, but in the complex interplay of many symbolic as well as material dimensions, a whole new approach emerges. According to this approach, it would be highly reductive and simplistic to focus just on one of these layers, say for instance, ownership relations alone. The focus, to make things short here, shifts much more towards one's own involvement or role within an overall institutional setup. Here again, one is neither totally identified with, or on the other extreme, totally outside existing structures. But the modes of power that bind both players together are much more intertwined. The positionings of artist, curator, institution, and maybe also critic and spectator or viewer nowadays builds a much more complex, maybe a kind of folded network, or as one could also say, there's always only some partial overlap going on in this kind of warped or folded space among the different players, but usually enough to make things work in some respect. But there seems, and I come to my very, very last point, but there seems to be some other ideological factor at work here as well. And this is a factor that, what I was referring to at the very beginning, that institutional critique was mostly blind to in a lot of its early instances, and one that is also not that easy to tackle. By this, I mean the generally liberal, open-minded, and critical attitude that contemporary art institutions, or at least some portion of it, usually hold in high esteem. Not that this liberalness is by itself an obstacle to serious criticality, but it appears as yet another paradox that the impulse to criticize society's many trouble spots nowadays almost appears like a kind of demand, something that is projected at artists' manifold endeavors from outside. It is no longer the fringes of culture and society that put forward radical claims and challenges, but such claims seem to come much more from deep within the existing institutions themselves. Now the development, concluding all this, then passing on to Helmut, the development in that respect has almost seemed to come full circle. Was it first the institution that had enabled a strand of critique to question and attack the very conditions of its own existence? It is nowadays the proliferation of conflict zones and critical issues that helps to legitimize, maybe consolidate the institutions again. So, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I say thank you. I don't have to say actually so much different things about institutional critique when Christian did, but I might tell my story out of a little bit different historical perspective. So I think we overlap in many ways, but and I'm also focused on this paradoxical situation of institutional critique, but I still, maybe the difference is that I maintain an idea of it at least as a sort of historical trajectory, which I still find interesting, and maybe this could be the debate, yeah, how we, estimate this history. Okay, so I'm not going directly into, the conditions of post-Fordist service industries and so on, but my statement is more concerned with the general problem we're discussing here, how institutional critique as a style or a practice, whatever it might be, can be related to the question raised by the former West concept. Former West, as we've heard already yesterday, understood as a sort of post-Western thinking or acting. In a way, it is this post terminology is used since the 80s. Laclau moved for post-Marxism, post-foundationalism now, or I like to talk about post-avant-garde. And I think those post terminologies are still interesting in a certain way, but they raise one specific problem, and that is that this act of transforming, the original Marxism to post-Marxism or whatever, in a way implies that you have to reject some elements of it, yeah? The historical narrative of Marxism or whatever, but others have to be affirmed. And of course, it's not so easy to distinguish those two. What are the good elements in this tradition and what are the bad elements? Yeah. So, for the West, is there the good Enlightenment tradition and where's the bad imperialism, or isn't just the good Enlightenment imperialist? Yeah. So that's, I guess, the main problem we are focusing here. And I would say, but that's part of the problem, and it needs some sort of an art of differentiation. Yeah. I would call that with Michael Warzer. And my question is, how can, institutional critique, be situated within, what we can call post-Western thinking, as difficult it might be to define that, and is there, a slight little chance that it could be able to contribute to such an art of differentiation? So, institutional critique is a quite misleading and irritating concept in itself. In a literal sense, as we've heard already before, it seems to imply a social condition beyond the institution, the Rousseauan tradition in a certain way, that there's some social space outside institution, which in my opinion is completely absurd, and an understanding of some kind of critical practice, be it political or artistic, which would guide us to such a condition, a pre or extra institutional social space. Understood in that literal sense, I would say institutional critique would be a very perfect example for a typical Western kind of thinking, providing a rigid distinction between the same, the institution, and the other, the real life, and proposing a projective practice imagining that other, whatever it might be. I will give you an example for that. And I take it, it's from Robert Smithson, a quote, and I take it because in the transversal issue from the EIPCP website in Vienna, they had an issue on institutional critique in 2006, and 3 writers in this issue are referring to this quote of Smithson, and that's why I think it's really a very central quote. It comes from Cultural Confinement, and I'm sure many of you know it very well. So this is Robert Smithson. Museums, like asylums and jails, have yards and cells. In other words, neutral rooms called galleries. A work of art, when placed in a gallery, loses its charge and becomes a portable object of surface disengaged from the outside world. A vacant white room with lights is still a submission to the neutral. The function of the warden curator is to separate art form from the rest of society. Next comes integration. Once the work of art is totally neutralized, ineffective, abstracted, safe, and politically lobotomized, it is ready to be consumed by society. So, here we go. We all know what kind of conclusions Smithson drew out of this harsh diagnosis. I mean, he went to the desert, to the Salt Lake in Utah, and he built the spiral jetty. He filmed it, and he died. And we all know, I guess, that the spiral jetty is a great work of art. And I'm the last one, contesting that, but it is also a great, in the typical Western colonial fantasy, it is literally a Western. It's building up his own monument value in a certain way. So it's a fantasy, a colonial fantasy about the outside and the other, the empty space, its availability for the intruder, a space which only waits to be elevated by a typical Western hippie. So Smithson, in this respect, I know there's a lot of other things which can be said about his work which are totally interesting, but in this respect he's just another Gauguin. And I would really repeat that, he's just another Gauguin. Of course, there's no direct connection between this quote of criticality, this harsh critique of institutions, and the spiral jetty. But clearly there is some kind of connection within the motivating horizon of the spiral jetty. The spiral jetty reveals, in a sense, the backside of this critique, of this harsh critique, the ideological fantasy which supports this critique. That means an extremely purist concept of the artwork, which is not at all lobotomized, which is not spoiled at all, which is just purely, pure art. That's the motivating force behind it, and I think this is an extremely important point, that he's using a highly idealistic and therefore also typically Western and bourgeois idea and concept of art, and that's what is realized in the land art monument in the Western. I'm using this example only to demonstrate that the relationship between institutional critique and former West is a quite complicated one. And Robert Smithson is not just one of the good founding fathers of institutional critique who defined I see as a really critical practice, whereas all the followers, especially those of the so-called second generation, I'm not using the term, but in transversal we're using it, generation of late 80s, early 90s, are more or less traitors to this real critique. Because they, the second generation, were just paving the way from a real external critique to a more internal differentiation of, of the understanding of an institution, from a radical artistic practice and approach for which Smithson is standing, to a more reformist, curatorial, administrational approach. When I did the project services with Andrea Fraser, that was the main, what they blamed us for. And finally, from resistance to systemic functioning within the post-Fordist economies. So the authors of a transversal issue they call the idea is to go back to the real one, to the real institutional critique, external, resisting, artistic, etc. And they call for a third generation of true activists, so not, being corrupted artists anymore. Of course, in their critique, they make lots of important points, and I'm not, most of them are friends of mine, and so this is friendly fire I'm sending out here. But I don't share at all this overall perspective of a genealogy they are designing from the good ones to the evil ones and back to the good ones, which are ourselves in a certain way. Yeah, that's their approach. Yeah. So. In my view, the tradition of institutional critique was always spoiled. Yeah? There is no pure idea of a good critique. And I'm pretty sure that it will always be difficult to claim art, and whatever art is such an ideological fantasy, to claim art in whatever aspect, to go beyond that. Very interesting in the transversal issue is one contribution by the Argentine activist collective Pro Maria, which is very massively attacking also the, artists in institutional critique. And their text is called Art, Radical Political Imagination. Radical political imagination, that's art. That's the idea of art. And the problem I have is that it is reproducing exactly within the activist, ideal. We are reproducing the deepest bourgeois cliché about what art could be. Yeah? I mean, it's totally idealistic. It's Schillerian, in its deepest sense. Yeah? And of course, I'm not discrediting their activists. I'm supporting. I think they're doing great work. But I think we have to be careful in what we are reproducing on their own, in their own language, in their own codes of representation. And this, in this case, is extremely idealistic. So I think as long as we try to understand institutional critique as a trigger to go beyond ideological fantasy, we are hopelessly trapped within it. And that is why I think it is precisely the transition from an external understanding of institutional critique to a more internal one was a very important move, the only move which allows us to maybe to situate institutional critique at least within the logic of post-Western thinking. And I give you some examples. Maybe we can show the image now. We have prepared for a while. So what appears in different artistic works and trajectories since the late 70s, that's why I'm also not referring to the generational issue so much, because it starts with many artists in the 70s. I just named some of them, Adrian Piper's work, for example, from 78, 77, 78 onwards, which was taken up by René Green by the late 80s, early 90s, or Louis Lawler's work, also of the late 70s, early 90s, which was taken up by Andrea Fraser, or Jack Goldstein, Richard Brent, which was taken up by Farid Amali in the same way. So there is a certain tradition, but this allows a different situating of what the 80s actually were about. And what they have in common, all those artists in a certain way, is a kind of categorical relationality they address. Yeah? So it's not with completely the opposition between, rigid opposition between inside and outside, but a relationality between the object, yeah, an image with Adrian Piper, for example, and the act of viewing. Yeah? What does it, what kind of responses do we have to an image of black people or whatever, or between the medium, the photography, and its different layers of representation, and finally between the institution and the social field. So especially Farid's project Reorient from 1989, that's what you see here. I mean, this took place more or less inside of Magicien de la Terre and had, I think, quite a different approach to post-coloniality. At that time, I mean, it was in a small gallery, and I think, in my memory, this is the most ambitious gallery show I've ever seen, because it was such a small space, and it had such a big impact of trying to retrace the Louvre as a symptom of a colonial culture, so to say. So post-coloniality was raised in a way, but also in other projects by him. He was addressing precisely the relationship between the institution, the Louvre or the Maison de la Culture in Saint-Étienne, and its audience, the ways they promote access to their spaces, and how those promotions are filled with colonial ideological fantasies. And also Renée Green in her work, sorry, I have to get a little bit lost. It's also a really important aspect, her work in the late 80s, early 90s, that she is not so much focusing on this here and there and the same and the other, but right on the in-between, on the traveling as a specific act of experience, the traveling of ethnographers, which shows up in her work. Yeah? Renée Green, yeah. This one is Farid Amali. He sits 2 seats beside you. So Renée's work is also precisely about those transitions, yeah, and focusing on that, and that is the crucial point in her work, I think. But also Andrea Fraser's work was mainly about this transition between the different levels of institutionality, we could call it, yeah, between the love of art as a social fantasy which is shared by all bourgeois global elites in the meantime. And the specific, practices and norm-setting practices within galleries, may I help you, yeah, attitudes of selling art, or the museum norms and things like that. Yeah? So what is especially addressed in all those kinds of work is precisely the transition, yeah? Not the inside-outside, but what is going on in between. So that in Andrea's case, the relationship between the social and the psychological, for example, the institutional norms and the private desires are the main subject her work is dealing with. So in all those projects, we are already, as viewers, we are already implied. There's no outside, no other more on which we can project or fantasize, or which we can claim to act for. It's indeed an internal one, an internal world, but of course a highly fragmented one. Yeah, it does not dissolute the fragments, but it's trying to focus on them and to make them conflicted spaces able to be experienced as an aesthetic experience. those internal worlds address us as subjects multiply divided into different directions of desires, opinions, identities, and they force us to differentiate and to decide, to make our choices in a certain way. Yeah? I mean, maybe in a different sense, as we heard yesterday, that capitalism wants us to make choices, but I think there is a different way to see that. Adrian Piper's work, for example, we made a show in Munich in '92, and she has always, images, and then asks the viewers, "What is your opinion? What do you see if you see an image of?" In this case of black people. Yeah? So our viewers in Munich bourgeois, Munich public audience, not in the context of riots in Eastern Germany, said, "Oh, in Eastern Germany they are so racist." Yeah? Mm-hmm. And so when we ask them to guide it with, but this is not what the piece is about, it's asking you, yeah? And when they say, "Oh, I'm not racist, I have a black friend," yeah? And that was really, really quite, you remember maybe, quite a crucial experience for me, that it was also very difficult to communicate with, but that was the challenge in a way. So this kind of institutional critique doesn't only challenge the site, the institution, but also my position within that as a viewer in a certain way. And I think this is already quite an achievement for what such a brand name like institutional critique can achieve. So to misunderstood or misread this internalization as an orientation only towards the art world and the art market as a preparation for the institutions to reassure themselves against any real critique is, in my opinion, not really justified. I'm coming to the end. So quite on the contrary, it still, 20 years later, it still seems quite crucially important for me to take up questions which were raised in those works. And I don't see a need for another generation of really, the real good artists, which are not spoiled, not compromised, or whatever. And those questions concern the fundamental relationality and interdependency of institution and real life, of social norms and private fantasies, of sameness and otherness, cultural and political spheres. And those interdependencies constitute no peaceful realm of realized democracy or whatever, but a highly agonistic field of what we could call entanglement. And I think it still needs this field of entanglement needs to be explored in articulation and reflection concerning its historical narratives, but also its segregating dynamics. Within the art world, for example, the community topic here for me is not just a good one, but also community is always segregating, always excluding others. So I have a much more skeptical view on the communal approach within politics, although I think, of course, there are also positive sides here. And the individual psychological strategies to cope with those narratives. So what does remain? What kind of questions do remain out of this kind of, historical narrative I'm projecting here? And the main question is, does it still make sense to speak of institutional critique as a brand name in relation to such possible explorations? And of course, it is still part of a hegemonial metropolitan, New York-based in the 80s, the Whitney program, as a also dominant discourse in a way, clearly. So, is it? Does it still make sense, or should we give it up and just go back to other terms or whatever? And the second would be: do individual and intentional art practices count at all? In this field, or also do we have to go into the direction of direct action, collective, and so on? And the third one, can aesthetic reflection and experience provide any useful contribution to that? It's also for the repristinization or whatever of the entanglement. I think of course, this would be to answer those questions would be another lecture, but I just wanted to throw it into the conference. But I only want to make one point, and I think it is precisely to answer all of them, precisely this tradition of institutional critique, which enables us at least to raise those questions and to address its inherent contradictions, which I think is an extremely important point, and not to dissolute or dissolve the tensions, out of which the entanglement is built up. So I'm not, my problem with the activist or with the culturalist view, as we've heard yesterday, that art is in YouTube nowadays, just as one example for many, so that we only have to just cultural producers the term goes in that direction, and I'm also a little bit skeptical about that. I think it's more important, of course, cultural productions are important, but I think it's important to keep up the tension, between what we call an artistic practice and what we call in cultural and what we call a political practice. There are different histories, different, ideas which are dealt with, and I think it's a chance to keep up those differences and not to dissolve them into one another. And that's why I think I would maintain and go for art practice as a very specific, cultural model of production, a model exploring mutually aesthetic and political form. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, maybe picking up on this immediately, you of course spelled out a lot of things that I was only pointing towards or hinting at in a much more substantial manner, but it seemed we ended up with kind of the same, at least keywords or key phrases as conclusions. So entanglement, for instance, came up in both of our conclusions. But I briefly wanted to get back to where you started out from with this impulse of this Missen impulse of doing something like totally outside the art system. Going to a place in nature that nobody maybe had touched before, and create a version of pure art there, which of course might have been one of the impulses between that first wave. But what is sometimes forgotten about or written out of histories is that there were a lot of, I think, contradictory impulses. Like even within the first wave of institutional critique, that this, getting outside, then of course investigating or sort of accusing the institution of some dubious economic intrigues in the background anyway. These are like the well-rehearsed motives, but there was also always this impulse of making it inside the institution, this of course was a critical gesture by pointing towards the exclusionary mechanisms that had worked in the art system up to a certain point. It just came to my mind, and I happen to have one of those examples of somebody who's usually not considered as belonging to institutional critique somehow altogether. And I excuse me that I only have this very low-tech reproduction of something which I could have digitized, but I couldn't get into it anymore. It's a piece by Yoko Ono done in 1971. It's an ad. Probably most of you know it anyway. An ad placed in the Village Voice, where she is announcing this Yoko Ono one-woman show, which of course was a fiction at that point, and the Museum of Modern Art had somehow became, if you count the F, like on her shopping bag, like within, it's suddenly the Museum of Modern Fart, and so those gestures had been around as well, but. Also, like on the other side of the East-West divide, back at back at that point, there were examples like this, and sorry again, that is hardly any recognized. It's only a wooden door also, and if you look closely enough, or if you, on the right-hand side, you see a little finger like coming through a hole, and it's actually a piece done by Goran Trubeljak in 1969, so this was very early on, and the caption or the text that comes along with it says, "From time to time, I stuck my finger through a hole in the door of the Modern Art Gallery in Zagreb, that is, without the management's knowledge." So that was already mocking that impulse or that huge need of artists to like make it into the institutions. But that may be only as an aside. How, because you talked of more internal differentiations, and there's probably more even there, like in the first wave or in the first historic phase, than we are trying to cover now somehow.
No, but, for sure. Yeah.
But you can jump in at any point.
I think I would agree completely. Of course, the first generation, and not only the first generation, the zero generation in the 1930s, when Benjamin and Brecht are discussing more or less institutional critique, or Diego Rivera in the Radio Music Hall, in the Rockefeller Center. I mean, the mural that was destroyed, because it had Trotsky and Lenin in it. Those are important elements of a history of institutional critique, and ideologically wise, it goes back, of course, to 18th century already. How institutions are conceived and criticized, and I think it's important to keep up with complex history, and its involvement, within the Western trajectory, but also the critical tradition is part of this trajectory, and so it is precisely to differentiate between, with different elements within it, and my point is only not to project it as and not to idealize it, as in this strange combination of it's a great artwork, it's a great political intervention, etc. And this is mutually, building up to really the great reference point. And that's why I'm used to it, because the transversal issue is really trying to set up a history like that, and that makes me a little bit allergic, but that is precisely that it has to be differentiated more in detail, and that also means that history is, of course, not over and it does not stop at some point, but those are the questions which are still at stake.
But I maybe wanted to, before we open this, I don't know if there are questions already, maybe one more point that I wanted to make, also referring to what you said about this move from resistance or this outside fantasy towards an internal differentiation, or towards systemic functioning. Because I think that this was really a kind of symptomatic thing, mostly happening in the 1990s, where there was also a lot of criticism put forward towards the 90s practitioners of institutional critique, of somehow losing its touch or losing its critical edge altogether. And I really wanted to hear your, or more of an assessment on your part on that. What comes to my mind, I mean, coming from Vienna, something that immediately comes to mind is the Generali Foundation, which doesn't exist the way it used to exist, but which of course was at the forefront of reintroducing or introducing altogether the second wave, at least in the Austrian context, and Munich and places you and Hedwig were involved in were, of course, much prior to that. But it occurred at a certain point, for instance, with an example that I have very clearly in my memory, an artwork by Simon Leung, and what he did for an exhibition in 1989. He demanded the kind of real estate, the list of real estate holdings of the insurance company, like all the buildings they owned in Vienna, and this is actually quite a lot, because I don't know how many he came up with, but it's dozens of buildings which they own. And his gesture towards it was to have himself photographed in a squatting position before like every single one of those real estate objects that the insurance company possessed. Now, in my happier moods, I'm very much inclined to think, well, great that somebody has finally done this and exposed this to the public, because people should. People know it anyway in a vague. At least some kind of way, that this is an international corporation that has, I don't know, lots of real estate, but nobody ever made the effort to like show it to a public what I don't know, their possessions were in a city like Vienna alone. So that would be that happier interpretation of it. In my more sinister moods, I'm getting to think, well, what's that supposed to be, and what does this tell us about being critical towards an institution, or has criticality maybe really gone all down the drain with like having yourself photographed, like squatting in front of a house in Vienna. So it has become something very moderate in a way, something, and I don't want to bring in the first wave of how maybe Hans Hacke would have gone about it, because I'm sure he wouldn't have gone different. He would not have gone about it much differently. But I would be curious about your assessment of what happened in that respect.
I mean, the whole generality discussion would go a little bit too far here. But of course, it's a very interesting example for if an insurance company becomes, how to say, threshold or whatever of institutional critique in a certain way, or wants to play that role in a certain way, and that almost all artists have collaborated in a certain way. I don't mean that in a negative sense. I was in the board in the beginning, in the early 90s. So we are all, involved in that, and they paid quite good money. So I still, I'm happy with that. Yeah. I didn't really, I'm not so happy with the politics Sabine Breitwieser made out of that. For me, this is a little bit too canonizing and too narrow approach. But of course, on the other hand, I think it's one of the very few, institutions which built up a serious collection and a serious program, and always open to young projects, and like the Militant project by Alice Kreischer and Andreas Siegmann and many others. So of course, this is ambivalent, and for all the artists, and I also don't expect, from artists that he's, solving the world's problem. So I liked Simon's work. It brought in different aspects of the discourse. I think so. I'm more. I know what you mean by the sinister mood, obviously quite well, and I think that is. I think in your talk that was for me also a very interesting point. This involvement, that this is only, when in this idealization of the artist critic, that is overlooked this other side. And for myself, this position, for example, working in a Kunstverein in the early 90s, working with institutional critique approaches and trying in this whole repoliticization field, was very clearly, how can I deal with that? How can I represent the institution on the one hand, and how can I distance myself from that? And I think this was the real challenge. Yeah? But this is an interesting problem in a certain way, and it's not, it didn't compromise myself in my, I don't have this vocabulary in a certain way, but it's that's precisely what it is about. How to negotiate that, yeah? How to negotiate those situations.
Helmut and Christian, can I just break in there, because we're on a very tight schedule, and thank you enormously for your contribution now, and to say that now we are breaking for 1 hour and a quarter, 1 hour 15 minutes. and that I'm sure there will be a number of questions for people. We will ask Christian and Helmut to join us for the plenary session at the end. So please, if you have some specific questions, please try and make a note of them, or a mental or a physical note. And we would love to return, I think, to these questions of institutional critique and institutional possibility in the plenary session at the end of today. Thank you very much, and see you in an hour and a quarter.